Golden State Media Concepts bring you Book Review Podcast, a haven for bookworms of all ages and the widest genres, from mystery to memoirs, romance to comedy, fantasy to sci-fi. If you love to read, this is a podcast for you. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast.
To the GSMC Book Review Podcast, brought to you, as always, by the GSMC Podcast Network. I hope you had a wonderful Labor Day weekend, especially if you had 3 days off. It is the fair, the county fair here in my hometown. I did not go this year. I haven't been in a long time, but I also haven't been here on this weekend. And I had planned on going very briefly to see the 4-H pigs that the twins of a friend of mine had entered in the fair, and then I didn't end up going. And for the most part, I didn't want to go just because lots and lots of people and immunocompromised father just thought it was a better idea to stay home, not go out in the midst of that craziness. And the number of COVID cases has gone up this week after that incident, or after that event. So, not surprising, I guess you could say. But anyway, I hope that your Labor Day weekend was good, that you did something that you enjoy, maybe got out a little bit or stayed in and read, whatever makes your heart happiest. As I mentioned at the end of the last episode, I am speaking today with author Seth Mullins. The book is called The Authors of This Dream. It is the first in his Edge of the Known series, and I just realized as I was preparing for this interview this episode, that this is the fourth interview in a row where I have episode, either one in a row, where it has been the first book in a series. So we started with Rhea and the Blood of the Nectar. That was the first in a series. Then it was The Resurrectionist Papers, also the first in a series. Last episode was A Canadian Werewolf in New York, also the first in a series. And now The Authors of This Dream, first in a series. So kind of exciting. Next episode, I believe, is a standalone. Yes, it is. So anyway, let me give you the description from the back of The Authors of This Dream. Brandon Chain's life is spinning out of control. After an altercation outside a performance venue nearly proves fatal, he's feeling at the mercy of dark forces threatening to tear his life apart. Even as a gifted poet and musician, his efforts to channel pain, frustration, and thwarted love into his music may not be enough to save him. Then he meets Saul Mason, a crisis counselor with the soul of a medicine man, who insists that Brandon's life and destiny are of his own making. With Saul's wisdom and guidance, Brandon begins a turbulent path of healing and spiritual awakening. But as his band, Edge of the Known, looks forward to a high-profile battle of the bands in New York City, heartbreak and a crisis of faith threaten to derail their first big break. Brandon finds that the dream he's worked so hard to achieve is not a cure-all for his wounds. Is there another, more resounding answer to be found? The truth reverberates within Brandon and in the lives of the hungry, searching souls touched by his music. That is, again, the description of The Authors of This Dream by Seth Mullins. If you listen to the interview with Seth and if you read the book, I can pretty much guarantee that you have met and spoken with someone who was going to sound a lot like Brandon. Someone who is very much in his own head, in that he processes things and thinks about things very deeply. That continues when he meets Saul, and they have very deep kind of philosophical conversations. You're going to recognize Brandon's character in people that you have known, and whether or not that is a musician per se, there's probably somebody who is an artist of some kind in your life, and who you're going to recognize parts of that person in Brandon. So let's go ahead and turn to the interview with Seth so that he can tell you more about this book and the series as a whole. Again, it's the Edge of the Known series. This is book 1, The Authors of This Dream, and the author is Seth Mullins. Hi, Seth. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Sarah. Thank you.
You're welcome. I'm excited to have you here to talk about the first book in your new series, Edge of the Known. The first book is called The Authors of This Dream. Before we get to the series and the first book, can you share a little bit about yourself, please?
Oh, let's see. I draw a lot upon my experience as a musician, songwriter. I used to perform a lot. It's been years, but it was a big passion of mine for a long time, and I gave it up for a few reasons. One is that I'm fairly introverted and not really accustomed to the whole rock and roll lifestyle, traveling and being seen, being on stage. But because it was such a love of mine, when I made the decision to focus on writing instead, music has been at the heart of everything I've written since then. So, and that's definitely true for this series. So, like a lot of people with those kind of aspirations, I did a lot of traveling and lived in New Mexico for a while, and then Oregon. I came back east at some point to Vermont, which is where I had grown up, Vermont and Connecticut. Also, there's a lot of states in between. Even recently, I went on a big journey. I was on trails in New Mexico and Arizona, Florida swamps, Appalachian Trail. So I have a roving foot and a roving mind, I guess.
Okay, well, that makes life interesting.
It does. And
yeah. So, go ahead. I'm sorry.
It's fresh imagery, fresh stimulus. Biggest challenge for me, I live in Vermont now, and the winter is pretty much half the year, sometimes more. It's very dark, cold. You tend to hole up. And as far as the work involved, being a writer, it's really conducive to that. At least you don't feel like you're missing a beautiful day while sitting in front of your computer hammering out the words. But you miss the stimulation of the colors and sounds of life and the bustle of human activity. It gets real quiet and dark, and it feels like hibernation. Every year around autumn, I vow to myself that I'm going to be someplace else by the time winter comes. But I keep trying. It hasn't happened yet.
Yeah, long winters can be hard, especially with, like seasonal affective disorder, things like that.
Yeah. Where are you at?
I currently live in Northern California, but I grew up in Montana.
Okay, so you know the drill.
Yep.
Yeah.
Well, in terms of the series, this is the first book, The Authors of This Dream. Can you share an overview of this first book?
It's a first-person narrative. The protagonist, Brandon, is in his early 20s at the onset. He's a really brilliant and inspired musician and poet, and has a strong desire to reach the wider human community from that place. On the other hand, he's had a lot of traumas and abuse in his life, a lot of things he hasn't worked through. As far as the fight or flight response goes to traumatic feelings and events, Brandon is definitely a fighter. So, like a lot of the musicians who died young or burned out, he's the archetypal wounded but gifted songwriter. Like the same things that fuel his muse are also kind of eating him alive. So what happens is, at a certain point, he meets a man who becomes his mentor, Saul. And the main thrust of Saul's work with him is he tries to get Brandon to understand how he's actually living in a self-created reality. Like, what he experiences is a reflection of what he believes. And so if he can become self-aware of what his beliefs are, then the power's in his hands to change any of those convictions and experience a different life. So a lot of the narrative is about that. It shows what he's confronting, and also how the picture of his life changes, as well as the way he behaves towards others. And because he's not an entirely sympathetic character to begin with, he feels that the world is beating him down, and he kind of wants to repay it in kind, in a way. Very defensive, reactive, and so these are the things that he works through. So on the one hand, it's kind of a spiritual memoir, and at the same time, it chronicles Brandon coming into his own voice as a creator, and also the early history of his band, Edge of the Known. They basically go on to become like the Beatles of our time. A group that is not only intensely creative, but also become cultural phenomenon and the catalyst behind a lot of cultural change. And that'll be explored more as it goes along.
Let's go ahead and take our first break of the podcast. When we come back, Seth and I will be talking more about Brandon as the main character and what might resonate with him for readers. So stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I'll be right back. Hey, it's Sarah here to tell you about the Infinity Pro by Conair with the Knot Doctor all in one dryer brush. I just took this traveling with me, and it is amazing in that it is a 3-in-1 tool. I didn't have to pack extra equipment with me just for my hair on this trip. It has a hair dryer. It is a volumizer. It is a detangler. It can do all of these things in one step. The large oval brush creates glam, waves, the bristles painlessly remove knots as you dry and style. It uses ionic technology to create a frizz-free look effortlessly. Speaking of that frizz-free look, there are 3 heat settings plus a cool setting that will lock in your look for effortless-looking hairstyles. It's got a bonus volumizing attachment included that gives you added lift at the roots. And the removable attachments make storage at home or away super easy. Like I said, I just traveled with it and it was so easy and so convenient. If you would like your very own Infinity Pro by Conair with the Knot Doctor all-in-one dryer brush, simply go to conair.com and search dryer brush. Again, that is Conair, CONAIR.com, and search dryer brush.
The GSMC Life and Happiness podcast takes you on a journey of exploration. We'll discuss tried and true methods alongside the latest trends of how to best live your life to its fullest and happiest. From psychology to meditation, science to self-help books, the GSMC Life and Happiness podcast will help you to discover what makes you happy and how you can live life being the best you possible. Download the GSMC Life and Happiness podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast. I am speaking today with Seth Mullins about the first in his series, Edge of the Known. The book is The Authors of This Dream. Let's go ahead and return now to that interview.
And you mentioned that Brandon, he's not always a sympathetic character, and I would agree with that. But what about him do you think will resonate with readers?
Well, that in itself could resonate with a lot of people. The story that first really galvanized me to want to be a writer was the Chronicles of Thomas Covenant, the Unbeliever, epic fantasy that came out in the late 70s. Stephen R. Donaldson. And Thomas Covenant is hard to sympathize with. He gets translated into this other reality, and for a lot of reasons, feels he needs to not believe in any of it. And in not believing in it, he acts kind of reprehensibly through a lot of it, because it's all just a dream, right? So he's got no responsibility to anyone or anything, because it's all just phantasms out of his mind. And he finally comes to realize that no matter where you find yourself or how you may define reality, you're still responsible for yourself. And I felt really inspired by reading about a hero who was flawed and struggling. I don't really respond very much to all these Marvel superheroes or, I don't know, protagonists who are just very upstanding right from the get-go. For one thing, there isn't really the arc there, the essence of the hero's journey, like how Joseph Campbell, mythologist, explained it. It's all about transformation and becoming more conscious and growing. So I think there's a lot in there that people could relate to. I know a lot of people struggling with disillusionment, even despair, dark thoughts, not a lot of hope for the world or for humanity. The thing about Saul's approach is you see the microcosm of it in this book, but you could also apply it to society as a whole. Just as Brandon's beliefs paint the picture of his life, popular beliefs paint the picture of our whole cultural experience.
And
that's another idea that'll be elaborated on as it goes along.
Right. And you mentioned Saul, and Saul is the person in the book with whom Brandon develops a relationship and who really kind of starts changing his perceptions and the way he's viewing the world. Can you talk a little bit about the relationship between Brandon and Saul and how it affects the story?
Saul changes the trajectory of his path. It seems likely that if Brandon had not met him, he would have done what many other wounded and gifted artists have done, died young, self-destructed in some way or another, or just burned out. Saul helps him find a way to own his gift and also question a lot of more detrimental beliefs that he has around it. The idea that an artist must suffer, for example, or that being a misfit or a misanthrope is a necessary part of the whole experience. So nobody can ever understand you. No one can really relate to you, and you don't have a place in the world. These are all beliefs that he carried, and he was creating his own personal hell because of it. So Saul helps him to understand that he's experiencing that because of what he believes and not the other way around. The usual perspective is just all the major belief systems, whether it's scientific or religious, it's all based around the idea that we're the product of the world, or the product of our environments or experiences that were thrust upon us. I'm this way because X, Y, and Z happened to me. So Saul's formula turns that inside out to say, like, you initiated these experiences. From within you, you created this reality. And so then, on the one hand, it's kind of intimidating. I'm responsible for all this. But if that understanding really settles inside, then you can realize that the power is in your hands to make it how you want. And that's why the book's called The Authors of This Dream. Like, this life could be seen as a dream, and we, being the dreamers, being the creators of the dream, have the power to make it a really beautiful, fulfilling dream, regardless of what the state of things may look like right now in the moment.
Yeah. What was your initial inspiration to write this series?
Well, I mentioned I always get back to writing about music. So my other big interest and passion for a lot of years was inner work and personal growth and spirituality. So I just got the idea to intertwine those two. One thing I've done a lot over the course of my life, I thought of it almost as a kind of job training that I would read. Just devoured so many biographies of poets and writers and musicians, many of them who lived what you'd consider tragic lifetimes. So really, I understand that arc, and the idea was like, what if, drawing on my other course of learning, what if somebody were to intervene and help such a person to get a broader, brighter perspective so that they can change course and they don't burn out, they don't die young, they don't have that cross to bear. And then where might it go from there? That was the basic idea I started out with.
Okay. And so it sounds like part of your initial reading, the reading of the biographies and everything kind of became some research basis for the series. Were there other types of research that you did for the book and the series?
As far as the metaphysical side or the spiritual side, there was a lot. Started out with me studying mythology and dream work, like Jungian psychology, and this was when I was in my late teens. And so at the time, I felt like I needed help with it all, and I worked with a therapist who worked with dreams, and also a lot of people involved in what's called alternative spirituality or New Age, maybe. I had a lot of disillusioning and frustrating experiences with that, where I'd start out thinking a certain teacher is very heart open and wise, and then realize that they're doing what they're doing for a lot of egotistical reasons. Or maybe they believe in what they're doing, but there's something very rigid and dogmatic about it, and a lot of rules. The cult mentality, So it informed a lot of my idea of what I didn't want to do with my mentor figure. Saul does what most self-proclaimed spiritual teachers don't. He won't take on the projection and be the wise, all-knowing guru. he always brings it back to yourself, you know. He's not creating your reality, you are. He's just a facilitator to help people understand how they're doing this, and to understand their own power, to choose their own thoughts and their own beliefs and all that. So that was the study, I guess, the field research I put into that. A lot of years, putting my faith in things that ended up leaving me feeling disillusioned, and more just informed my sense. I got to the point where I thought, well, why doesn't anyone work from this perspective? So I figured if such a therapist doesn't exist, I should invent him.
Exactly. Right what you want to see, right?
There you go, yeah.
Time for our second break of the podcast. When we come back, Seth and I will be talking about some of the autobiographical elements within the book. So stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I will be right back.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
GSMC Book Review Podcast and my interview with author Seth Mullins. Let's get back to that conversation.
I know it's based a little bit on your own experiences as a musician. So can you talk about kind of the parts you kept of yourself and what you fictionalized throughout the series?
Oh, let's see. Well, like I was describing earlier, a lot of it was more a process of elimination. Like what I experienced personally helped me to define my own image of a teaching figure more by what I wanted to avoid or what I didn't want him to be, because I had never really, in the final analysis, if there is such a thing, felt very fulfilled or happy with any of it. I felt like I'd really gotten taken for a ride, kind of, by this charismatic teacher or that. So Saul wouldn't exist if I hadn't had those experiences. It helped to clarify all that.
Okay.
As far as, yeah.
Go ahead.
Oh, just with on the musical end of things, it's a lot of the details. You know, I've wrote songs, rehearsed with other people, performed. I did all the things the band does, just not on the scale that they end up doing it. But I understand what those processors are like. Both when it's just when it was just me by myself trying to take hold of what I was feeling in the moment or what I really wanted to communicate and putting it into a form, finding the words, finding the melody that expresses it, to what it's like then when you're dealing with the band chemistry and how that can either bolster your vision or take away from it because you're trying to work with people who don't really get what you're trying to do. There's a lot of camaraderie within Edge of the Known. Even though they don't always agree, there's some deep underlying respect and love. And Brandon probably would never have made a record in his life if not for the other guys. They have different strengths and weaknesses, and so it's the chemistry that they have together and the way they bolster each other that really makes it powerful.
How many books do you envision in the series? Do you have a set number at the moment?
Yes, at the moment the set number is 6. I'm editing the second book, which is called Gossamer Veils. So I'm kind of in the home stretch with that one. And I've got the outline and about half of book 3 written. The Gospel of Tommy. That's kind of a double entendre. It's a reference to their bass player, Tommy Visconti, who's known for being very loquacious and going on his inspired speeches and rants at great length. So it's kind of an inside joke with the band. It's also a play on one of the lost books of the Bible, or a book that was excised.
One of the
Gospel
yeah.
of Thomas. Yeah. Which expresses a lot of the same philosophy that Saul does.
And is there anything that you can talk about? We don't want to give too much away that happens in the first book for people who haven't read it, but what can you tell my listeners about what happens next for the series?
Probably anyone who reads this one will put it together that this band's going to be very big, so probably not giving that away if I mention that. And none of them are particularly well equipped to deal with fame. Their families never had money. They were the misfits in school. It all kind of hits them out of left field, and particularly Brandon, because he's the one who the media focuses on, making him out to be a kind of shaman of a new religion.
Yeah, I can see that none of the band members would necessarily have the coping skills it would take for that type of fame. You mentioned, kind of a Beatles-esque level, and yeah. So you've been a musician. You said that you tend to be a little bit of a wanderer of both body and spirit or mind.
Yes.
what drew you to writing? Did you always want to write, or did that come later in life?
It happened pretty early. Well, when I discovered Thomas Covenant, like I mentioned earlier, I can remember that whole experience really vividly. And I don't know what words I might have used, my 11-year-old self, but I was reading this book, and it was really a illuminating experience. And I remember one thought that I had was that this story was telling me more about what was really going on within our world than I could ever get from watching the news or reading a newspaper or magazine. Like somehow it was illuminating what's going on inside of us. And I just thought, I want to do this. I didn't even think of it in terms of I want to be a novelist or something. Just whatever this is, that this effect that this author is weaving on me, I want to do that for other people. So that's where it started. But a really realized novel requires a lot of life experience. No matter how brilliant you may be, you need to have accumulated a certain amount of experience of life to really be able to do it. So it was difficult waiting all those years and having this burning desire, but not yet quite the ability, because I just hadn't seen and felt and learned enough yet to really flesh it out and bring it to life.
Time for the final break of the podcast. When we come back, Seth and I will be talking about Seth's advice for aspiring authors. Stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I'll be right back.
Golden State Media Concepts Social Media Podcast. Time to hashtag everything. We talk about all the fun, crazy stories on social media. From Instagram to Facebook, Twitter to Tumblr, or probably even Friendster. Join us each week as we explore the quirky side of social media. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Social Media Podcast.
It's simple, such a sad song. The one that we rely on to get us.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast and the conclusion of my interview with author Seth Mullins.
Do you then, from your own experience, have advice for aspiring authors?
Finding your own voice is the most crucial thing, I think.
Okay.
There's a lot of advice to be found out there, and the difficulty there is that the climate constantly evolves and changes. And I'm speaking as somebody who's tried many times to find just a certain concrete road you could follow to bring your own vision to fruition and make something happen. Find an agent, find a publisher, and then something will happen. A recent example being, well, it's not so recent anymore, but like the internet completely changed all the dynamics of publishing. So I personally got to a point where I felt like I had to let that go and find my own way, my own voice, and just trust my own intuitive sense of how to move with it. Because it never worked for me trying to map it out and say, well, if you do steps A, B, and C, then you'll be able to get to your destination. It never worked out. So, but I also think that's what makes any novel enduring as well. It's the voice. It's the distinctive stamp that the author puts on it that could only have come from them.
Mm-hmm. So when you take the time to read for yourself, do you tend to veer toward those more philosophical kind of spiritual leaders, or what types of genres and authors do you enjoy for your personal reading?
As far as the spiritual side of things, my favorite is the Seth material by Jane Roberts, which I avoided reading for years because of the name. My name being Seth. Yeah, and I lived in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and it's kind of a new age mecca in America, kind of like Sedona, Arizona is. And I was hearing that a lot. Oh, your name's Seth? You read those books? Yeah. But I love them, and it's very much based around that sort of Gnostic or Hermetic philosophy. And, you create your own reality. That was Seth basically coined that phrase in the early 70s. So that's what I go back to for that. And I tend to like a lot of epical things really broad in scope and with a lot of speculative elements. Frank Herbert's Dune series, epic fantasies. I still go back to Lord of the Rings every few years. I already mentioned Covenant. The beat writers, big influence. Jack Kerouac, Allen Ginsberg's poetry, Arthur Rimbaud, the French symbolist who was a big influence on the beats. That taught me a lot about just a different way to use language and how to just let go and let your mind run naturally. Don't judge, you can edit later, but tap that vein and just, go with it. Go where the juice is. So I tend to go back to Kerouac a lot, and On the Road was an influence for this book. The band does a lot of traveling, and Jack had a great way of just capturing the essence of an event, or the exhilaration of just being catapulted out into the universe and just running with it. And at times he can make a trip to the diner sound like a mystical experience. His way with language really illuminates the magic and beauty of things. Even normally mundane things.
Okay.
So I think that's all the big ones. I'm actually gonna look at my bookcase here and see if I missed anything. Well, I already mentioned tons of music
Mhm.
biographies, a lot on Jim Morrison, Kurt Cobain, Mark Lanigan, like a lot. I got his memoir, and also he put out a couple books about his lyrics and the stories behind his songs. Yeah, I got a biography of Rimbaud here. Nietzsche, The Birth of Tragedy. That was a big influence because it's all about the Greeks' conception of tragedy, and a lot about just the spirit of music and what Nietzsche calls the Dionysian. If you've ever heard a song where you almost ache, and like the hair standing up in the back of your neck or something, and like, what is that feeling? That's the Greeks referred to that as Dionysus, or Dionysus embodied that for them. And so that's a big thing, because that's what Edge of the Known is always reaching for. It's kind of what they live for. Because the idea, like as Nietzsche wrote about it, is there's no way to escape suffering in this life. No matter what kind of life you have, you will see what you love fade away, die. Nothing is permanent. So the answer that the Greeks found to that was not to try to order life in such a way as to minimize pain, but to embrace everything and work themselves into a kind of this rapturous state, which has a lot of parallels to what a great rock concert could be, where everyone's just letting go and to the power of the music, and you feel like nothing can touch you in that place. You're just caught up in the passion and the energy of it all. And that's Edge of the Known's credo. That's the gold they're always trying to mine.
All right. Well, thank you for that. Do you have a website? If you can tell people what the website is, and then also what social media platforms you're on.
SethMullins.com. And I have all my social media links there, but I mainly go by A Poetic Wanderer, all lowercase. So I'm a Poetic Wanderer on Instagram and Twitter. On Facebook, I just go by my name, Seth Mullins.
All right. Thank you. So, Seth, we've talked about the book and the series and a variety of different other things, but is there anything that we haven't covered that you were particularly wanting to touch on during our time together?
I don't think so. It really got rolling there, actually, for a while. I think we covered a lot of ground.
Well, I want to thank you for taking the time to talk to me about the first book in your Edge of the Known series. I really appreciate you taking that time.
I appreciate having me, Sarah. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you once again to Seth for joining me to talk about not only the authors of this dream, but the series as a whole. Again, the series is Edge of the Known. And I'm wondering if after you heard the interview and a little bit more about the book and the series and Brandon as the main character, if you, in fact, know someone who reminds you of Brandon, or Brandon reminds you of this friend or acquaintance. I definitely knew people like that in college. I probably know people like that now. I'm just not thinking of them off the top of my head. But yeah, Brandon definitely resonated with me in certain ways, in just the way he approaches the world, and his his way of dealing with things. It's not, of course, a perfect existence. It isn't for any of us, but just sometimes artists come with those dark places within them, and I think Brandon exemplifies that. So thank you to Seth, and if you are a fan of this type of, it's not a memoir, it's not autobiographical to Seth's life, but it does kind of read like a memoir of someone in the music industry, and if that's the type of book that appeals to you, you should definitely check out not only this book but the series as well. I hope that you will join me for the next episode, when I will be speaking with Jody S. Rosenfeld about her book Closer to Fine. And speaking of music, I have had Closer to Fine by the Indigo Girls stuck in my head. I get it stuck in my head every time I pick up that book. So it's a really good thing that I love that song by the Indigo Girls, because it's been in my head a lot lately. So join me for that interview. In the meantime, as always, if you're a fan of the podcast, please do me the favor and the honor of leaving a review, whether written or starred. Also, follow the podcast on social media, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. I love hearing from listeners, so hit me up with comments or questions. Hope that you had, again, a great Labor Day weekend. I hope your week is off to a good start, and I hope that whatever you did over the weekend or what you're doing this week, that there's, as always, plenty of time for you to get yourself lost in a good book. Thank you so much.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.